General Hospital spoilers talk about Brad could no longer sit idly by while Drew continued to manipulate and control his life. After accepting $1 million from Drew and leaving Port Charles, Brad knew that he had only temporarily escaped the threat. Drew would never let him go. Thus, in the shadows, Brad silently returned, looking for a way to reconnect with Poria and begin a dangerous plan to defeat Drew, once and for all. Brad's plan wasn't simply about exposing the truth that Drew had fabricated. He understood that Portia's strength and decisiveness could be the key to solving everything, but only if she stood by him and they worked together to bring Drew down. They secretly devised a plan, aiming at Drew's biggest weakness, his arrogance and unwavering belief in his ability to manipulate others. Brad knew that Drew wasn't just using his power to control people but was also overconfident in his ability to manage every situation. His arrogance, his belief that he was the smartest person in the room, was his vulnerability. Drew thought he was untouchable, that everyone around him was simply a pawn in his game. Because of this, Brad decided that not only would he defeat Drew, but he would also make Drew pay for everything he had done. One of the key people Brad needed to align with was Poria. He knew that although she was being blackmailed by Drew, her strength and resolve could be the deciding factor in changing the game. At first, Brad approached Poria discreetly, without raising any suspicions. He spoke about Drew's mistakes, explaining how Drew had been exploiting her. He convinced Poria that if they worked together, they could overthrow Drew and protect not just themselves but also their loved ones. At first, Poria didn't fully trust Brad, but the more she listened, the more she realized that Brad's plan might be the only way to escape Drew's control. With Poria on his side, Brad and she set to work on a complex and risky plan. They would have to do everything in secrecy, without Drew suspecting a thing. Every step, every action had to be calculated. Their goal wasn't just to expose Drew's lies, but to attack his overconfidence, which he had placed in every decision, every manipulation he had carried out, including framing Tracy. Brad didn't just want to save Poria, but he also wanted revenge for everything Drew had done, not just blackmailing him but also the dark games he had orchestrated to use people for his own gain. Throughout the process, Brad and Poria faced numerous challenges. They couldn't act too openly, because Drew was always watching their every move. However, Brad knew that Drew, with all his pride and self-assurance, had exposed too many weaknesses. He thought he could easily frame Tracy by planting lies, creating false evidence, and turning everyone against her. But Brad and Poria had recognized something crucial. Drew could rely on nothing he believed to be true. What he thought was real was merely a trap he had set for himself. Brad and Portia's plan wasn't just about revealing the truth, it was also about attacking Drew's pride. They knew that if Drew believed he had won, he would be blind to any threats. When everything was meticulously planned, Brad and Poria began to execute their first step, making Drew believe that Tracy was the one who had drugged him. They left vague traces, pieces of information that only Drew would have access to, making him believe that he had full control over the situation. But things didn't go as Drew expected. As he continued to push forward with his plan and expose everything to the public, culminating in Tracy's arrest, he couldn't fathom that he was being played. The evidence he had fabricated was completely reversed by Brad and Poria. He didn't realize that he himself was the pawn in a game that he had created. When the truth started to surface, Drew felt everything crumble beneath him. Tracy, who he had thought would bear the consequences of his actions, was not the only one harmed. Drew, the man who had always believed in his ability to control others, now saw that he was the one being manipulated. He was exposed in front of everyone, from colleagues in the hospital to his own family. Everyone saw the real Drew, and no one trusted his lies anymore. In the end, Drew's failure wasn't just the collapse of his schemes, it was a harsh lesson about arrogance and underestimating others. Meanwhile, Brad and Poria, who had once feared they would remain under Drew's thumb forever, became the winners. What they had done not only freed them from Drew's grip, but also brought justice to those who had been deceived and exploited by him. Everyone in Port Charles felt a sense of satisfaction as they watched Drew pay for his misdeeds. Brad knew that Drew saw himself as the most powerful person in the room, someone who was in complete control of every situation. Drew believed he could manipulate anyone, Poria, Tracy, and everyone else in his path, like mere pawns in his game. He was confident that he could easily destroy Tracy's life, framing her in a drugging scandal he had carefully orchestrated through threats, bribery, and manipulation. Drew thought that with his web of lies, he could control the outcome of everything, from Portia's compliance to Tracy's downfall. However, Brad and Poria were far from being the helpless pawns Drew thought they were. They were playing a much deeper game, and Drew had grossly underestimated them. As their plan began to unfold, Brad and Poria worked in secret, moving strategically behind the scenes. They knew that Drew was still under the illusion that he was in complete control. He continued to manipulate Poria, pressuring her to do his bidding, believing that she had no choice but to comply. Yet, little did Drew know, with every move he made, he was setting himself up for a fall. Brad had already anticipated that Drew would be overconfident, thinking that everything would go according to his plan, and that arrogance would be his undoing. The first signs of Drew's overconfidence began to show when he started to notice things weren't quite adding up. Small inconsistencies in the narrative he'd carefully crafted started to surface. But he dismissed them as mere coincidences. He thought he could handle everything, that he could smooth over any problems with his usual tactics of manipulation and threats. But what Drew failed to realize was that the very evidence he had fabricated, the accusations he had planted, and the people he had used to his advantage were beginning to unravel in ways he couldn't have predicted. Brad and Portia's quiet resistance began to take effect. Poria, despite the pressure Drew had placed on her, had quietly started to turn the tide. She, with Brad's help, began planting seeds of doubt about the stories Drew had constructed, using his own methods against him. Slowly but surely, Drew's fabricated world of lies began to crumble, and with it, his confidence started to erode. What Drew didn't realize was that the walls he had built around his own lies were much more fragile than he thought. At the heart of Drew's plan was Tracy. He had hoped to use her as a scapegoat for his drugging scheme, and initially, it seemed as though everything was going according to plan. Tracy, who had always been a powerful figure in Port Charles, was now caught in the snare of Drew's deceit. But as the investigation began and the evidence against her piled up, something unexpected happened. Tracy, once the pawn in Drew's elaborate scheme, slowly began to see through the manipulation. As Max started to interrogate her, she was initially stunned, unable to believe what was happening. She was blindsided by the accusations and could hardly process the weight of what was unfolding. But as the interrogation continued, Tracy began to piece things together, realizing that the strings of this entire operation were being pulled by none other than Drew. Drew had thought Tracy would crumble under pressure, that she would be just another casualty in his pursuit of power. But instead, Tracy, though initially overwhelmed, started to regain her composure. She began to understand that the person who was truly responsible for everything, the one who had manipulated her, framed her, and used her as a pawn, was Drew himself. She felt a rush of disbelief at the realization that her own nephew had orchestrated everything, and the anger she felt at the betrayal began to fuel her resolve. Tracy, far from being a victim in Drew's eyes, was now waking up to the reality of the game he had played. As Tracy processed everything, she could see the truth behind Drew's actions. What she had once seen as a plausible set of circumstances, now appeared as nothing more than a web of lies and deceit woven by a man who had no moral boundaries. Drew, who thought he was playing the game of power and manipulation, had unknowingly become the pawn in a game that was bigger than him. As Tracy's understanding deepened, she could no longer ignore the fact that Drew had set her up. He had used her as a scapegoat, and in doing so, had underestimated not just her, but everyone who had been part of the plan to take him down. Drew's downfall came not from his enemies but from his own hubris. His belief that he could control everyone around him and manipulate the truth to his advantage was his greatest mistake. Tracy, empowered by the realization that she had been played, turned the tables on Drew. She began to cooperate with Mac, slowly unraveling the layers of Drew's lies, and exposing his role in the entire operation. By the time the truth came out, Drew was left with no escape. The evidence of his deception, fabricated and manipulated, was now laid bare for all to see. For Drew, the final blow came when he realized that he had been played for a fool in his own game. He had thought he was the one pulling the strings, but in the end, it was Tracy, Brad, and Poria who had maneuvered him into a corner. The truth came out piece by piece, and Drew found himself facing the consequences of his actions, with no one left to trust, no one left to manipulate. His once solid position of power was now shattered, and with it, his control over Poria, Tracy, and the others who had been under his thumb. As Drew fell from grace, the satisfaction of those who had been victims of his manipulation was palpable. What Drew had intended as a calculated move to destroy others had instead become the catalyst for his own ruin. Tracy, once caught in his web, was now free from his control, and Poria, who had been forced into compliance, could now breathe a sigh of relief knowing she had helped bring Drew to justice. Drew's arrogance had led to his downfall, and the very people he had thought he could control had turned the tables, ensuring that justice was served. Drew's downfall was not just the failure of his schemes, it was the unraveling of his carefully crafted persona as a victim, a man who had always claimed to be misunderstood and wrongly accused. As the truth about his actions began to surface, the reality of his manipulation, deceit, and betrayal started to take shape. He had spent so much time convincing everyone around him that he was the good guy, that he was the one being wronged by the world, but now, with every revelation, that illusion shattered like glass. Drew had spent years building his empire on lies, manipulation, and power. He thought he could control everything, from his relationships to the people he interacted with. For a long time, he believed that his connections with people like Poria, Tracy, and Brad were just stepping stones to further his own ambitions. He had treated them like pawns, using them in whatever way suited him, believing that their loyalty would never waver because he held the strings of their lives. He saw himself as untouchable, his power, his influence, were so deeply embedded in Port Charles that no one could question him, no one could challenge him. But the truth was that Drew's arrogance and his belief in his own invulnerability were his greatest weaknesses. He had underestimated the people around him, especially Brad and Poria. Brad, once a man manipulated by Drew, had become his greatest adversary, while Poria, who had been caught in Drew's web of deceit, had found the strength to fight back. Together, they had turned the tables on him, using his own methods of manipulation against him, exposing the darkness he had hidden beneath the surface. As they worked to bring him down, Drew failed to see that the people he had so carelessly used and dismissed were now standing together, determined to make him pay. As the truth began to emerge, Drew was forced to confront not only the failure of his plans but the sheer depth of his betrayal. The city of Port Charles, which had long been under his influence, began to wake up to the man they had been blindly following. His carefully constructed image as a victim, as someone who had been wronged by the world, crumbled before their eyes. It was revealed that he had been the one pulling the strings all along, his betrayal of Poria, his manipulation of Tracy, and his cold, calculated use of everyone who trusted him. The people who had once viewed him as a respectable figure now saw him for what he truly was, a man driven by greed, power, and a complete disregard for the people around him. As the city began to learn about Drew's manipulations, the anger and betrayal felt by those he had wronged were palpable. The resentment from the people he had exploited for years reached a boiling point. Tracy, once a victim in his scheme, now stood as a symbol of defiance, as she made it clear that Drew would not get away with destroying her life. Poria, who had been blackmailed and controlled, found the strength to speak out, revealing the full extent of Drew's manipulation. Even those who had once been loyal to him, such as members of his family, began to question everything they had believed about him. The facade he had built was crumbling, and the truth was impossible to ignore. Drew had always believed that his power and his ability to control others were his greatest strengths, but in the end, they were the very things that brought about his destruction. He had blinded himself to the people who truly mattered, treating them like disposable pieces in his game. He had thought that as long as he held the cards, no one could challenge him. But Brad and Poria had shown him the greatest lesson of all, that power gained through manipulation and deceit is fragile. And it will always come back to haunt those who wield it. As the truth continued to unfold, Drew's pride and belief in his invulnerability became his downfall. The more the public learned about the depths of his deception, the more the city turned against him. His friends, family, and colleagues who had once supported him began to distance themselves from him, unable to stomach the lies he had told and the people he had hurt. The betrayal was not just personal, it was public. And it was devastating. Drew had underestimated the strength of the people he had taken for granted, and now, those very people were the ones who would ensure that he faced the consequences of his actions. In the end, Drew's fall from grace was not just about the destruction of his plans. It was about the destruction of the man he had once been, someone who believed he could manipulate and control the world around him. And someone who thought he was above the consequences of his actions. His blind trust in his own power led him to believe that he could escape justice, but in the end, it was his arrogance. His betrayal of those closest to him, and his overestimation of his own control that led to his undoing. As Drew stood in the aftermath of his downfall, he was forced to reckon with the fact that he had become his own worst enemy. The anger, the hatred, the betrayal of those he had wronged, these were the true consequences of his actions. No longer the man in control, Drew was left to face the consequences of the darkness he had sowed in his pursuit of power. The city of Port Charles had seen through his lies, and now they would ensure that he paid for the lives he had ruined, the trust he had shattered, and the power he had abused. Drew had spent his life building an empire of lies, but in the end, it was the truth that would bring him to his knees. The final outcome of Drew's reign was nothing short of a shocking and unexpected downfall. For those who had believed he would triumph, the reality of his defeat hit with an overwhelming sense of disbelief. Drew, once considered the most powerful and cunning man in Port Charles, found himself facing an unimaginable collapse. He had been so sure of his own strength, his ability to manipulate everyone around him, that he never once considered the possibility that those he had used would rise up against him. Now, the very people he had once controlled, Tracy, Poria, and Brad, were the ones who stood victorious, while Drew descended into the depths of his own destruction. Drew's loss of power wasn't just about the fall of his plans, it was the complete disintegration of everything he had worked for. He had always prided himself on his ability to control, to maneuver through any obstacle with a deft hand. But in the end, it was his own hubris that proved to be his undoing. The more he tried to push his agenda forward, the more it unraveled. And the more his enemies, who were once his pawns, transformed into his executioners. Tracy, once the target of his plot, had not only survived his treachery but had turned the tables on him. Poria, initially blackmailed and coerced, found the courage to expose Drew for the manipulator he truly was. Brad, who had been under Drew's thumb, had orchestrated his own quiet but powerful resistance. Together, they made Drew realize that no matter how powerful he believed himself to be, there were forces more potent than his manipulation. The turning point came when Drew's web of lies, deceit, and betrayal was completely laid bare. No longer able to hide behind his smokescreen of power, Drew was forced to confront the truth. The people who had once admired and trusted him were now horrified by the man he had become. His family, his colleagues, and his allies, people he had thought he could rely on, began to turn their backs on him. The foundation of his influence, built on lies and manipulation, cracked and crumbled, leaving him standing alone, exposed, and powerless. Tracy, Poria, and Brad had been ensnared in Drew's intricate plots, but they had managed to break free from his grip, each in their own way. Tracy, despite being dragged into Drew's schemes, had used her strength and resilience to fight back. She had long been a pillar in Port Charles, and Drew's attempts to destroy her only fueled her resolve to take him down. Poria, despite the blackmail and pressure she had endured, found the strength to expose Drew's true nature. Realizing that she no longer needed to be afraid of him, And Brad, the man Drew had thought he had silenced and manipulated, had risen from the ashes of his own betrayal to become Drew's fiercest opponent. Drew's actions had led to irreparable damage, not only to the lives of those he had deceived but to his own reputation. His belief in his invincibility, in his ability to outwit everyone around him, had blinded him to the fact that his greatest weakness was his arrogance. He could not see that the very people he thought he controlled had been watching him all along, waiting for the right moment to strike back. His greatest strength, his ability to manipulate, became his greatest vulnerability, as those he had betrayed used his tactics against him. As Drew's downfall unfolded, the shockwaves were felt throughout Port Charles. The city, which had once been under his control, now saw him for what he truly was, a man who had abused his power, manipulated the truth, and ruined the lives of everyone who had trusted him. No longer able to hide behind his power or his false bravado, Drew was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. He had thought he could play the game of power indefinitely, but he had failed to recognize one crucial fact. The most dangerous players in this game were not the ones with the loudest voices or the most influence, but the ones who were willing to rise up in silence and bring the truth to light. In the end, Drew's downfall was a humbling lesson in the fragility of power. He had been so focused on controlling the game, on manipulating everyone around him, that he had forgotten the most important rule. Those who seek to control others are often the most vulnerable to being controlled themselves. Drew had believed that by holding the strings, he could dictate the fate of everyone in Port Charles. But in the end, it was his inability to recognize his own weaknesses, to see the cracks in his carefully constructed empire, that led to his downfall. The city of Port Charles, once a place where Drew held all the power, now saw him for who he truly was, a man who had let his own arrogance destroy everything he had worked for. Tracy, Poria, and Brad, despite the immense challenges they had faced, stood strong in the face of adversity. They had endured Drew's manipulation and betrayal, but in the end, they had risen above it. Their strength and unity proving that even the most powerful man can fall when he cannot recognize his own vulnerabilities. Drew's arrogance had blinded him to the truth, and in the end, it was his own pride that led him to be toppled from the throne he had built for himself. The final battle, the one he had never seen coming, was not just about losing power, it was about losing everything, as the people he had once sought to control turned the tables and made him face the consequences of his actions.